Welcome back to the crux of the matter. I'm Riley Stansberry.
And I'm Landon Connor.
So we did go 200 some odd days between the 15th and 14th episodes of the pod, but we're back already with the 16th, only a few weeks later. So that tells you that we're committed again, and we have a pretty special episode for you guys today. We have with us Brian Wilson, who is the founder of Montana Classical College, and it's a new institution that's focused on promoting excellence for the human body and soul, especially by educating people on the writings and sayings of history's greatest thinkers and writers. Brian, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and MCC and what you guys do over there?
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here. And it was really great to talk to you, Riley, about McKinley before. And it's fun to talk about these things now. So Montana Classical College right now is just an online institution that hopes to put a shovel in the ground in the future. Because I think human beings being in the same place at bottom is the way that they'll form the kinds of friendships required in order to do the great tasks that need to be done by Americans now. And the idea first came to me when the COVID lockdowns happened, when college students had to go home. And it made me wonder, what will it be like for parents to actually maybe see some of the Zoom lectures? What if they're like, "Oh, sweetie, you know what's going on? What's happening in this lecture? What are they saying that Thomas the Tank Engine is doing with this like strange postmodern theory or something?" and that part of like what would happen is that also that college students would realize that they weren't there at all for the education, and maybe they already knew that in some cases, but that they would realize they were there to have fun and just to like scrape by with a credential, and that what seemed to be the thing that should be at the center, the preparing the way for the full flowering of your soul is just simply kind of unavailable and generally not even sought for by many students, especially because if you've never had a taste of the real thing, if you never had a teacher that could set your soul on fire, who really could show you something, I don't know, it's like you don't even know what you're missing. Like I remember the best class that I ever took. Within 30 minutes, in college, I knew it would be the best class I would ever take in my entire life. And it fulfilled the bill. So if you haven't had a taste of it, you don't know even what you're looking for to begin with. So, and maybe to say one other thing is I got a degree sort of like in great books or something like that, kind of interdisciplinary between literature and philosophy. But I think it affected my mind at first, but it didn't really strike my heart. It didn't fill my heart enough. Like I thought okay, so you're supposed to really closely read. I get it. The great thinkers are very smart and things like that. But there's a way in which it was only a kind of intellectual abstraction or a hobby that you sort of think about Plato in your head and then you let the New York Times control your heart or something like that. And that,
yes.
It's kind of embarrassing, but I was certainly the case that like after 4 years of just reading the great books, I was kind of apolitical, but I was very easily captured by the left shortly after college, which I'm embarrassed to say that this is the case, but so it was. And so I think that part of what I want to impress upon students at MCC is like to give them some protection against that kind of naivete that I sort of underwent so that they can be guarded against false opinions a little bit faster. Because I think to read the great books right now actually is to make a political choice, because there is a political party that if they don't want to see them burned, at the very least don't want them to have a place in their universities. And so in that sense, then, even if you're not like a Donald Trump voter or something like that, by caring about Plato, there's a way in which you're already a conservative in the deepest sense of the word of wanting to conserve Western civilization. And so if that's what you want to do, then you have to start to look, politically speaking, well, how do we preserve Western civilization, in which, political parties doing that? Not that I ever want it to be the case that, we have to check a box of are you going to vote for Vance in 2028? Otherwise, class in the Scarlet Letter. That's a kind of embarrassing level of partisanship. I guess I only think of it as I guess you could put it like this, that there's no such thing as a value neutral education. That doesn't exist. Even
Indeed.
if you went to a vocational technical school, you're saying, I value not having an ideology in education, and I also value having this skill. And then you have to ask, what kind of society is a society that values this skill or something like that? So if you can't get out a value neutral, or if you can't have a value neutral education, then let's be explicit about what the values are. Let's say that I want to promote noble deeds, the understanding of nature, and nationalism. I think those are good things And those are things that will shepherd the great books, and that the great books will also nourish in turn. And so that's the kind of education that I want to bestow, to the extent that it's within my capacity and in the capacity of people that I kind of work with. And I think you'll find, if you listen to like this series that I did on Homer's Iliad, actually, I don't think you should try to say the most based thing possible just to be provocative or something like that. You want the text to like unfold, and you want to see like Homer's wiser than I am. And probably Homer thinks a lot of based things on one hand, but also when he compares his own activity to other characters, like in the Iliad, Helen is kind of putting images on a tapestry. And like, what is Homer doing but putting images of war on a tapestry? And so Helen too is like drawing warriors. And like the god Hephaestus who limps, he builds the house that holds all the Olympian gods. And he builds Achilles' shield, which has a whole world on it, like the city at war, the city at peace, and other things besides. And so it's almost like in that way, like Homer builds the house that holds the gods, like in the Iliad in a way. Homer builds this cosmos or this world. And so in that way, Homer is less like Achilles than he is like a woman and like a cripple. And like that is what it is. It doesn't mean that he doesn't admire great warriors. In fact, it seems like he dedicated his life to trying to understand their speeches and their deeds and presenting them in the fullness of their glory. But he's not a warrior. And so, you know what I mean? It's not about saying like, look, Achilles killed people and he's really powerful. That means that like that's the only good thing in life. So that's not what I mean by like saying that I want to have an activist college. I want to have honest, close readings of great texts. And sometimes that will yield very surprising results.
Indeed. I mean, the modern institution kind of says that it's a neutral institution in word, but indeed, you're only allowed to read the great thinkers in certain ways, and that you're certainly encouraged to read the great thinkers in a certain way. And it's like if you read what Aristotle has to say about like the formation of civilization, like you're kind of you either have to read into the text something that he's not saying, or you have to say this is what he is saying and it's bad. And I think that even though you're admitting, yes, like I have this set of values at my institution, at Montana Classical College, if we know that those are the values that you have, then maybe we can read the great thinkers, and occasionally we'll find something that might even go against one of the stated values of your institution, but you know that they're there the whole time. And so in that way, I think like to some of our listeners, like it might sound like, okay, like this guy's ready to take up the flag and rah, rah, and this is a MAGA college or whatever. But I don't really think that's what you're doing. And in fact, I think because of the ideas that you've just stated, I think your college and your project is more in line with the old actual capital L liberal education in the West, which we now call classical liberal or whatever, or classical schooling. But I think that if I had to choose between MCC and Harvard and say which one is more representative of Western civilization, I think I would pick MCC.
Oof, that's a high bar set. Well done.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, hopefully I don't get excoriated for that, but we'll see. Yeah.
Well, because like what it's like, it seems to me insane kind of that you would want all colleges to like, say that we're preparing our students for global citizenship. Like your college is in this country. So at least a light level of nationalism or patriotism seems like an indispensable prerequisite for an educated citizenry. You want them to be able to perform noble deeds, like to be willing to sacrifice themselves on behalf of their family, on behalf of their country, and to value and admire people who are willing to do noble things that are not pleasurable. And also like to understand like human nature, like in a weird way, like I almost, those sound like right-wing ideals, but I think that they're just, they just seem like healthy, ordinary things that wouldn't be so strange to say. That only sound strange now. Like you wouldn't have to even use the word nationalism, like 200 years ago, it would just be taken for granted that your institution should be wanting you to be a good citizen on behalf of your nation. So in a way, like, I don't think I'm even trying to do anything controversial, even though it sounds controversial on the face of it today.
That's fair. That's a fair read. And I think that kind of ties us back into, because you've given us a very good mini synopsis on Homer, and talking about nationalism and the sort of what's good for our nation, noble deeds for our nation. We live in America. This is an American podcast. I've looked at our analytics. It's 97.7% American or whatever. There are a couple Canadian stragglers. But for the most part, like that's the worldview that we bring to the table. And so today we wanted to talk to Brian about the American Renaissance in literature, which happened in the 19th century, because a lot of the time, you know, we hear about people like Lewis and Tolkien, British thinkers from the mid-century. We hear about people from a long time ago, Shakespeare and Milton, English thinkers from a long time ago, much longer ago. We hear about the great Enlightenment thinkers. We hear about Rousseau. We hear about Voltaire. We hear about the great writers of the ancient Greeks, and both their thinkers and their storytellers. But I think a lot of people are not really super familiar with their own canon. And so could you give us a little rundown on what the American Renaissance in literature was and what it was about?
Yeah. So like Emerson writes his essay Self-Reliance in 1841 or 1842. Hawthorne writes his like great collection of short stories, Mosses from an Old Manse, in the 1840s, and then writes The Scarlet Letter in 1850. Melville writes Moby Dick in 1851. I'm going to miss the year that Twain publishes The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. But like Edgar Allan Poe is alive at this time. Thoreau is alive at this time. Walt Whitman is kind of like, you know, one of the younger guys, like at the end of this, that there's like a way in which you kind of have like a sort of galaxy of human beings, all of whom know each other. They all hung out the way in which, like, so for whatever reason, Melville destroyed all the letters that he got from Hawthorne. There's like speculation on various reasons, like why that was. And I don't know. Well, we can leave that there and just say that, but we do have all of Melville's letters to Hawthorne. And, you know, when he reads Mosses from an Old Manse, he reads it like kind of like as he's starting to write Moby Dick. And he's just so impressed by his older friend. And, you know, he sort of like loves him. He loves how, you know, incredible Mosses from an Old Manse is. He thinks it's the best thing that's been written since Shakespeare's plays. And Melville's a great admirer of Shakespeare. So you've got this galaxy of guys who are getting to know each other, who all at various points take trips to Europe to meet some of the great European authors and come back. And there is a kind of sense of like, okay, so America has now emerged out of a period of like pure necessity in a way. Like you've got past the revolution, you've got past the War of 1812. The Civil War is still on the horizon, but it hasn't happened yet. And maybe you could say there's a kind of like settling in now. Okay, so because you could say that literature in a strict sense is not necessary initially for a people. They don't need it right away. In a way, you rely on the deeds of the warriors to tell the story of the nation at first and its statesmen. But once there's a little bit more leisure, once there's a little bit more plenty, now something new can happen. And Nathaniel Hawthorne has this, my favorite short story by him, at least at the moment, although every time I read a new one, I'm like, well, maybe this is the best one. But at any rate, in Earth's Holocaust, it's like this story where this like these progressive reformers, they want to like make the world pure. So they get rid of things like old titles to monarchy. They get rid of guns. They get rid of tobacco and alcohol. They want to get rid of like all the external temptations to sin so that they can bring man, you know, back to the Garden of Eden almost in a way. But one of the things that they burn, they decide to burn all books because they also want to liberate themselves from the minds of dead men. And when Shakespeare's works are burned, they burn brightly and almost like it seems like it takes forever for them to burn. When the Bible is thrown in, it doesn't actually burn. That's like the one miracle of the story is that it's not able to burn. So, but when American works are thrown into the fire, it's almost like dry kindling that immediately explodes. And just it doesn't provide fuel for the fire. So it seemed to me what Hawthorne was saying is that there's a kind of like anxiety amongst American authors about their awareness that like Shakespeare has done something better than any of them have done. And perhaps it's a big thing, you know, to say how to compare these things, since we're like at the bottom of the mountain and we're looking at the top of these peaks of mountains when you're comparing, you know, guys like Hawthorne to Shakespeare. But there's an awareness that the English literary tradition is outstanding. Like all of these guys love it. None of them are looking back and thinking like, oh, that was trash. We're going to do something good. They're like, no, that was amazing. And it's like a kind of a very serious undertaking to think that we could be worthy of equaling or surpassing it. But the attempt has to be made. So it seems like Hawthorne, in a somewhat like self-conscious way, is trying to create models for the Americans, models to emulate on one hand, but mostly I would say his writings include models not to emulate. Like in Earth's Holocaust, it seems like he excoriates progressive utopians. But in the Scarlet Letter, he seems to excoriate Christian utopians who are utopians like in this world. Like we can make a society without sin. Everybody can be a saint. No need for repentance here. That, that's not so good. But he also writes a book called The Blithedale Romance, in which he kind of makes fun of transcendentalists. He takes them seriously because he worked on one of these like transcendentalist, co-op farms. And so like here, so it's like he critiques the transcendentalists, Christians, and progressives. And so, and in the short story called The Custom House at the beginning of the Scarlet Letter, he looks at his own time, and he seems to find it also lacking. So there's a way in which there's also a lot of critique by Hawthorne of various American attempts to create a perfect society or a good society. And so maybe he wants to point the way towards something that's better. But anyway, so this it's just amazing. I didn't realize that all these guys are writing at the same time. It just like, I just feel stupid for figuring this out, so late in life in a way. Like, why wasn't this told to me when I was like a 19-year-old in an American literature class, that the greatest authors that ever lived all were in the same place and working on this kind of project together?
Yeah, well, that was one thing that's kind of surprised me, because I didn't know it either. And in preparing for the pod and reading up on some of these Renaissance writers, I read up on Emerson, and he goes to England and he meets all of my favorite author, C.S. Lewis. He meets all of C.S. Lewis's idols. He meets Thomas Carlyle, and he meets Wordsworth and Coleridge, some of the great poets in the English tradition. Like, all those guys are alive at the same time that Emerson and Hawthorne and Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe and all these people are alive. And it's like, holy cow, this is like, we might look back on this in, we might be 200 years bygone from that era and look back on it and be like, holy cow, that might have been the last gasp of great Western literature, or, something before a great renewal of Western literature or whatever. I don't mean to lead the audience on in any way, but it is kind of a shocking fact.
Right. Yes. This is just a quick funny anecdote about Hawthorne that I just read yesterday, is that his wife, she was a very sickly woman and sort of never was out of bed, was always being seen by doctors. But days after meeting Hawthorne, she seems to have been healed, and they were married, and they stayed married, for the duration of their lives. But so Hawthorne has such a powerful soul that he can heal the sick with his love. This is just a cool anecdote. Sorry, it's not as connected to other things, but
it might be true. I think it is true, actually. I think I also read that. But the other thing is that the era of American politics that they're alive in is a super interesting era to me. 19th century history is one of my specialties, at least in European history, but also all American history I genuinely love. And they're kind of all in the prime of life during the Mexican-American War. And I couldn't find anything that any of them had written about it. But it's kind of interesting to me the parts of American society that they latch onto and that they talk about, because like a lot of the great authors, sometimes they talk about these things explicitly. Emerson, at least, was kind of in league with the abolitionist movement. And so he, in his personal life, he's very intertwined with the Union side of the Civil War. But they also make interesting comments on the state of American social affairs, about slavery, obviously, but also about the difference between the rich and poor, about what Puritan New England society is like, the differences between the North and the South. And to me, what it seems like is these authors are living during an era where America is being made into America. If you go back to the 1780s, 1787, we get the Constitution. Beginning of the 1780s is the end of the Revolutionary War. So we are America. Obviously, if you look back on the timeline, that is quote unquote America. But they're still kind of just Englishmen living abroad. There's not that much to differentiate us from all of the the loyalists who fled north into the icy wasteland, and those people became Canadians. So to me, these people, because of these critiques that they're making during the Renaissance era, they're almost, through their critique, they're almost building an idea of what America is and what it ought to be. I don't know. What do you think, Lando?
Yeah. the framework of which we place our identity, I think, changes over time. And you have to be in a place of desperation to really cause that desire to plunge deep into your mind and say, why do I want to know this? And that's what I was curious, Brian. I had some questions for you. Like, what do you think drove you and what drives individuals to really want to tap into literature at a level? Because I think that's a key part we lose in our modern culture. I was reading the stat, like the number of books we read a year peaks at like second and third grade at like 55 books, and then drops to only about 6 books a year once you hit 12th grade. And we are going to continue seeing this decline probably unless something major changes, just because of course, the rise of social media, other education consumption, and a either increase in polarization or politicization of books, or just a decline in the actual appeal of media through text on a screen, or the increase of the appeal of text on a screen. But if we really ask ourselves, what makes us want to dive into thoughts that require an aspect of your brain that is very provocative, but provides no imagery of its own nature, is curious. And so I guess to simplify, then people like Emerson, there's a big aspect of let's return to nature. Why is that so crucial for this literature? A lot of nature will dive into that because that is appealing to the human nature side. And so through Montana Classical College, I'm curious, what would be the either goal for young adults or children to be adults to really see in literature?
Whoa, that's a great question. And a couple great questions within it. So why do we have the need to read literature? So for one part, I guess you could say you start to form your moral imagination, and you sort of start to think like what's possible in like the domain of ethics. Like you can raise the question, what's like good and bad, what's just and unjust. You get these models to imitate on one hand. Like you could see some sort of like act of like incredible manliness that seems impossible for you or something like that, that makes you suddenly like want to be more that way. So in Moby Dick, sort of the main character Ishmael's sidekick in a certain sense, although maybe not simply a sidekick, maybe that we should call him his friend, Queequeg, the way like he's living in Africa and he wants to get on this whaling boat, and the whaling boat's like, we're full, we don't want anybody. So Queequeg like gets on his canoe at night and goes up to this like much bigger vessel, and he jumps off of his canoe in a way that capsizes it, in a way that like he doesn't have any mode of return in a way. And he like grabs hold of this boat, and the captain of the boat comes out and takes out his sword, and he threatens to sort of like cut his hands in a way that will compel him to go down. But Queequeg sort of says to him like, I'm the son of a king, I won't let go. And so the king, this captain is kind of overawed by the daring and the manliness of this guy. And so he's like, okay, you know what? You can have it. You can get on this boat because of what you've just done. It's like you see images of like that, and you can see greatness of soul within another human being. And then you can start to measure the size of your own soul, like the daring of yourself, like the moral capacities that you have. Like what's the most courageous thing that you've ever done? And then so you can start to gain some sort of like inspiration to be more courageous, and well, there's a lot to say about these kinds of things with respect to courage, but that's one reason to tap into literature. And I guess it just seems to me that you get all of these sketches of different forms of political life on one hand, like through the Scarlet Letter, you can start to see like, okay, well, if you take being obedient to God to be the most important thing, like the one thing most needful, how should you organize your community? And it seems like all of a sudden a theocracy doesn't seem crazy, and it seems like Hawthorne wants to explore what a kind of theocratic community looks like, and you can kind of see its pitfalls. And I'm sure that you could have a better theocratic community than the Puritans in Salem in the 1600s. I think you could do better than that. But nevertheless, it seems like the core problem that the Puritans there experience is that there's such a desire to seem to others like you're following God's will, that there's a kind of ultimately more of a concealing of sin than there is of like a, repenting for your sins or things like that. So there's like a way in which
that's good.
It accidentally encourages you to see yourself through the eyes of man instead of imagining yourself as like being seen by God. And now again, it doesn't have to do that necessarily, but you get to see that. So you get to see political communities on one hand, and then you get to see these beautiful sketches of the human soul on the other. So I guess yeah, so expanding your moral imagination in this way by seeing these models, I think helps. And you get to think through all these like different questions. Like there's so many like little weird, not weird, but like philosophical reveries in Moby Dick, where like at one point Ishmael sort of says like, well, if you close your eyes, that's how you are like your own most self and like your own identity. And then you kind of you can close your eyes and say like, am I more like myself or not like myself? And so you get to ask yourself all these questions. And I found reading Emerson's Self-Reliance that was maybe a text most of all that I felt stung in the sense that I realized I wasn't measuring up very well when it comes to like the opinions of others determining my actions sometimes when I really think that they ought not to, or something like that, like moments of cowardice. And I hate those moments, but there's a way in which like Emerson encourages you to see your cowardice and try to overcome it. So anyway, there's like lots and lots of examples, but I think those are some of the greatest things that you can see. And you can sort of see, what do all of these human beings want? What do they think will make them happy? And what are the obstacles either within their own souls or in the external world that prevent them from getting the things? And are they right about what's going to make them happy? And so you can't help but then ask this like about your own life. So as you reflect on why these characters do what they do and try to sympathetically understand them as they understand themselves, then you start to think more, become much more self-reflective about your own moral opinions, why you hold them, whether you should hold them or not. And like whenever your own actions are admirable or base, and just yeah. Yeah. And I guess like my favorite thinker or philosopher is Plato by far and away. But he's such a literary philosopher that it's sort of like maybe more inclined towards literary works. And then I think to go to, Riley's question from earlier, I sort of like realized how ignorant I was of like my own tradition. So like, I'm like at MCC saying like, oh, nationalism is good. Okay, well, what is your nation's literature like? I read some stuff in college, and then I read the Greeks, okay, and Shakespeare. So, but be a nationalist. Okay, well, understand your own nation. Like, how good is it? Should you love it? And I'm finding our tradition is very lovable. Thank goodness. But you asked other questions, Landon, but I think I sort of like mostly just like hung on that first one. Is there anything else that I really ought to have addressed in what you said that I didn't?
No, that's a really good launch pad, because going back to Riley's question, I like what you touched on. So kind of developing a moral framework, or kind of increasing that imagination, being able to be taught how to think, not exactly what to think. We can disagree with some of the classical thinkers, but at least it forces you to recognize the need to think beyond always the present, or also kind of have a humble mindset towards past tradition, which is the essence of the conservative prudence I think people like Franklin Kirk tap into. And then also, I guess, I love your mention of Moby Dick, because probably the first classic I ever read, second, third grade, was that one. And I wish I could say I remember more, but there's so many themes, and the thematic elements really tap into the classical human condition. And I think at its essence, the kind of base level, we boil it all down. Why does literature matter? Because it relates to the human condition. And that's probably a myopic view in total, but at least it recognizes why, like specifically for me, a big passion of mine is young men seem to be in the most helpless and identity crisis type state in modern times tracking. Why is that? And can literature help alleviate that concern? A big part of it, I agree, is yes, because one, it teaches you how to think, how to humble yourselves. And then comparison, you mentioned how it does force you to kind of compare yourself to the conditions that are posited by the book. But then that taps into Riley's questions. Why did America gain its identity during this crucial time in the American history? And a big part of it's because amidst the Industrial Revolution and new discussions over socio-political questions like slavery, and then other levels of, oh, are we going to war with Britain again? Well, War of 1812 happened. Yes, apparently we are. Oh, no, now we need to really separate ourselves and create our own national identity. And then you come to this question of, okay, we do actually have to look back to now the founders and compare ourselves and weigh, or really stand up to them and say, where are we at? Are we standing on their shoulders? Are we looking them eye to the eye? Or are we saying we're just going to forsake that and move on? And literature requires you to anchor yourself to where they put you. But it also demands, like you mentioned, Moby Dick, that risk, that ability to jump off that canoe and to say, we're going to stay anchored on this one point here, which is literature, but also develop a new framework out of it. And that is where America gained its identity. was that willingness to take the risk and say, we actually are going to respond to literature and develop on it. So you hit on all the great points. I think I tried to clumsily go through with those questions, but very, very thought provocative. Thank you.
Yeah. I think there's like something you'd said, about, this like kind of awkward relationship between like America and tradition in a way. It's kind of interesting to me that like in one hand you could, and it seems like there's like different conservative schools of thought, like on the American founding, like some really insisting like, these are just Anglos doing Anglo things. You basically have Anglo common law. These are just English people. Yeah. I think Riley maybe said it before, like just living abroad or something along those lines. Whereas like some people are like, no. Our emphasis like on the natural rights tradition really is a kind of break with common law. And it is something kind of like a little bit new, how much we emphasize it, like in the American political theory. I think like Tom West's book on the American founding talks about that like a little bit. Well, actually quite a bit, not a little bit. But so there's like different breaks between like something like what Russell Kirk would say on one hand and maybe like what Tom West would say on the other. And there's like plenty of other positions within there. But there's like a way in which like Emerson does kind of want to break with tradition, like in a massive way. So that seems to be one huge strain of thought within American literature is like Emerson, I don't know, he's almost a little bit vicious when he talks about the Bible, when he sort of says like, if you hear people talk about like, wanting to talk about God, thinking about these old moldering nations and cities. And I'm thinking he's thinking of like, if you're talking about Jerusalem, if you're talking about Rome, I don't care. I want like a completely direct access with God, not mediated through the words of others. That's what I want. So it's, this is a kind of like funny segue maybe into talking a little bit about Emerson, because it seemed to me, and this is like the last part of the essay that I'm writing on him right now that I was going to talk about, but that I didn't send to you guys because I just haven't written it yet, is that something, like part of what I try to do in the essay is show there's various common moral opinions that we have today that like are words or statements that are in Emerson's thought, but that he interprets 100% differently. But I think the one place where he's kind of guilty in a way is this kind of a spiritual versus religious, like people saying like, oh, I'm spiritual, but like, I'm not going to go to church, man. And I think that I believe Emerson that he's pretty serious about trying to kind of commune with the voice of God, and that somehow that's like available within yourself. Because I think he's not trying to be an autonomous individual following his own will. I think he does want to tie his will to God's will, but he thinks that going to church will be an obstacle to doing that. Like it's just going to like bring out this whole like subset of problems of like other people seeing how you're praying, what you're doing, and things along those lines, and that you're going to like fall prey to, various forms of conformity. And it's just going to be kind of like outward agreement, but it's not going to be like the full throated on fire soul turning towards God. And it seems like there's a way in which you could really interpret Emerson and the Transcendentalists as being the precursor to like, I'm not religious, I'm just spiritual. Like I'm going to like do yoga or something. And like, this is,
you're saying like, that Emerson is like the girls who have like, crystals and they use their astrology sign to like get dates. So
right. Well, I would say like he's not at all that type, but his words interpreted by that type of person ring true to them in a way. Like it's almost like when you read this essay, it's like human beings of like lower moral caliber kind of see what they want to see and project into it, and they just take away what they want. I mean, I thought this was the most right-wing essay that I might have ever read in a way, in certain respects. Like,
okay, back from a quick break. Brian had just started to talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay called Self-Reliance, and Brian was just talking about sort of how it relates to what we've been talking about so far. So, Brian, if you want to pick it up where you left off.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I think that there's a way in which you find a lot of contemporary moral opinions nested within this essay that sound like very bad opinions, like very lib opinions in a way. But in the context of the essay, I don't think they are at all. So maybe I could like walk through like 4 of those really quickly, just to sort of say like, what's our opinion about this line versus like how Emerson understands it. At the beginning of the essay, he talks about that you have to have the confidence to believe that the truth that is in your heart is the truth that's in the heart of like every other man, that you have to somehow believe this. And when you start to talk about the truth that's in my heart, that almost kind of rhymes with like, oh, he's telling me to believe my truth, like believe her truth, things like that. And something like the her truth, my truth kind of thing is a kind of like an epistemological claim that like every human being has like distorted access to the truth, but we're just choosing kind of like arbitrarily to just believe the woman's opinion now instead of the man's. Neither of them really knows, but her truth is what works now, or something to that effect. But Emerson is not saying that. He seems to think that if you are a truly self-reliant human being who's looking into your heart and trying to like understand things, that you could objectively know the truth in your heart. And that's the truth that ought to be in everybody else's heart. And that you really, I don't know, have to have a lot of self-confidence on like your own judgment in a way.
He's almost saying to have conviction in your own ideals and in your own thinking, because if you don't, then like, why would you even have an opinion in the first place? That's kind of the read I got from his essay.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally right. That almost like the disposition of having conviction is more important than the actual content of it. Because it's like, if you have actual, if you have content that's like true or whatever, like maybe like whatever you read Plato and like you got like a true idea, if you don't have like the doggedness to stay committed to that thought, well, it doesn't matter in a way. Now, he also says later in the essay that you have to be willing to contradict yourself, that if the truth seems to you to be different tomorrow than it did today, well, you have to believe that like you have better access to it like the next day, that you did something that allows you to see the world more clearly. So you shouldn't be afraid of people attacking you for believing one thing yesterday and believing a new thing today. You just have the confidence. You just have to have the confidence in your judgment that you're right about this kind of thing. So that's like one thing, that he's not saying whatever floats your boat works. He's saying, no, my boat is made out of like very, seaworthy materials. Your boat is made out of paper. It's going to sink. That's like how he would understand that kind of thing. So he opens up the essay in a way that like, if you are, and this is to go back to Landon's point before, that like one of the reasons maybe to read literature, I guess, is to become more self-aware of your, I guess like your own moral and political opinions, so that you don't accidentally project them onto the text. Because once you know what they are, then you're in a better position to discover what's in the text, as opposed to just projecting what you want to see. Because I'm imagining like a contemporary reader who's reading this, and they can find almost all the opinions that they want to find. But I think if you look at the context, it kind of flips all those opinions on their heads. Like the next one is, he has a line where he says, "Take me as I am." And when we think about the line, "Take me as I am," we think about life that's kind of in decline, like a vulnerable person who doesn't want to become worthy of somebody else's love, but who takes himself to be good enough. And therefore, like, just love me. I'm not going to get better for you. Like, take me as I am. Okay. Which is like a horrible sentiment. Like, how could you not want to become like more worthy of your wife's love or something like that? It's disgusting.
Well, even a perfect example is like how people talk about church, like, oh, just come as you are into church. Okay, that's fine initially, right? Like if you're unregenerate and you're like destined for the fires of hell, then like, yeah, get in there. But the point is not to like get in there and stay the same. The point is to get in there, and as C.S. Lewis would say, like the whole point of this life that we're in and of converting is so that we can become more like God. We can become better creatures. We can become better Christians. And we don't remain the same as we were the whole time. It's like what Paul says about, moving on from milk to solid food. Like so that the sentiment can be good if it's communicated in the correct way. It's just like you're saying, the modern way is just kind of like, like I'm just gonna lay around in my room with my action figures and Legos and just like leave my bed unmade, and like I'm not gonna come into school like wearing a nice outfit. I'm gonna wear like sweatpants and a Creed shirt. I don't know. Actually, if you're wearing a Creed shirt, that's fine. But
right, yeah, and so like when he says "take me as I am," I think it's like shortly before that he says, "I'm going to speak harsh truths today. I'm going to speak harsh truths tomorrow." And there's a way in which the people within his sphere are going to feel uncomfortable, because he might have to say harsh truths about them and how they're living, that he's not living by their opinions. That's not what he's bound to in a way. And so he's sort of saying like, I'm so resplendent and strong that I'm going to have to like, follow the truth wherever it goes. Oh, and it's almost like kind of like an echo of, like in Plato's Republic, when Socrates says like, I love Homer, but I love the truth more. And when Aristotle, like in the Ethics, says, I love Plato, but I love the truth more, like right before they criticize them. And in this case, he sort of says, well, like I love my wife and my family, but I love the truth more. Now that's obviously a controversial way to put it, but you could also suggest that this is like, I think a different claim than saying like, take me as I am because I'm like weak and I'm not going to improve, but take me as I am because it's going to be very difficult to be around somebody who's constantly trying to improve and constantly trying to bring themselves closer into communion with the truth, that occasionally that's going to like cause you to disagree, possibly in like very big and explosive ways. So when he says, take me as I am, it's not from a position of weakness, but from a position of strength, I think. So the modern person looks at this and is like, oh yeah, I want to be taken as I am too. But he doesn't mean what we mean when he says that. He also talks like non-conformism, like as being a great good. And I think there's like a way in which like a lot of contemporary people want to just like flip off their parents, you know, when they like want to restrain like their, you know, pleasure seeking, like in any respect whatsoever. Like almost like the band Sum 41. I don't know if this is like a band Zoomers have ever listened to, but millennials have like all heard the song Fat Lip. And he talks about, you know, being a casualty of society. Like, I don't want you to tell me, you know, to like grow up and things like that, as if like there's like some one way everybody's supposed to act at a certain age. But there's a way in which like contemporary nonconformism is just like a sloughing off of like duty and responsibility, like in favor of just like skateboarding and drinking or something like that. And actually skateboarding is better than what most people do. Like you know, proposing with the Legos and things like that. I think every young boy should have Legos at some point, but
I agree.
Maybe there's like a way out of it. And so like, it seems like Emerson's nonconformism again is like very different. And he works in the essay to try to say that he's looking towards a kind of natural law as opposed to just his own whims or something like that, that it's not just an impulse he's following. Like, don't just do what people do, like in the book of Brave New World, like satisfy all of like your sexual desires as if you're an infant craving food or something like that. That's not what Emerson is saying. He sort of says like, try to live one day under this law. And when he talks about the law of nature, he talks about nature in a kind of sense in which the weak perish and the strong like succeed. Like that kind of like almost like a might makes right kind of thing, that he wants to approximate the law of nature within his own soul while living in society. And something else interesting that I think maybe some people who like transcendentalism get confused by, and who maybe Thoreau was very confused by when he wrote Walden, is that in the Self-Reliance essay, Emerson says like you can't be a hermit. Like you have to be in the presence of others, precisely because we all dream of that thing that we want to do or say to people when we're in private. Like you have your boss who's like an asshole or something, or some person who did some injustice to you, and you think in private how you want to treat them. But when you come face to face, you lack the spine to say what's required or like what would be even be just or something like that. And so he thinks that like you have to be constantly in the presence of others, at least not to say you shouldn't ever go out into nature. It also is a nature essay, talks a lot about going out into nature, but it can't be a permanent hermit-like state, because then there's no test of your self-reliance, and you might be inclined to build up a picture of yourself that sort of like sees yourself as much, much better than you are, because you haven't had to bow to the pressure of others. And now the final one is something I really want to hear what you guys think about. This is, he could be guilty of inspiring something like the spiritual versus religious dichotomy. Like when people say, I don't really like organized religion, but like I'm spiritual, you know, I think there's something out there. And when Emerson talks about this, I think he really believes that it's possible to commune with God through some sort of like deep meditative stance, like through the interior, that God is within us. And if he's within us, then searching within ourselves, we can find him and access his will and commune with it. So on one hand, he's got this like law of nature thing. And on the other hand, he's like, well, we can access God's will. And like, is God telling us to like follow the law of nature? I don't know. But at the very least, like he says something kind of biting about the Bible when he says, don't listen to those like moldering words from these other nations and cities. And I think he has something like Jerusalem and Rome in mind. Like the Bible is not the access point to God. Like what the pastor or the priest is saying, that's not the access point to God. You can do it yourself. You don't need the Bible. You don't need the priest. You don't need the church. You can do it yourself. And I think that like I don't know. There could be some rare type of individual who's kind of capable of doing that, but I don't know if that's good for most people to attempt or to try. But I'm really curious what you guys think about that. Like, is he misguided or like disastrously mistaken when he makes this proposal?
I mean, yes, I do. Like, Lewis talks about, to bring up C.S. Lewis again, he talks about, and I want to say it's in The Abolition of Man, he talks about the law of nature. And he talks about, like, there are, like, basically 4 different kinds of things that people mean by nature. And so even when you're talking, and Lewis is like, you know, he reads Plato and he doesn't like Aristotle. Right. So you kind of have an idea of what he's talking about when he says the law of nature. But all the same, the reason that we believe the things that we do about the world, and this is like probably the most like fire and brimstone evangelical thing that I like believe, but like it is through the disclosed word of God. And people draw in theology, people draw this distinction between special revelation and natural revelation, like they're different, and it's like not really. Like there's all one kind, but the Bible is like a kind of revelation that tells us what God thinks about the world and how things are supposed to be. And the thing is like going back to the values thing that we talked about earlier, it's going to impose moral limits upon you, and it's going to impose moral limits upon your family and upon your civilization. And it's going to have, if your civilization and your family and your community adopts biblical thinking, then you're going to run up against a wall of people who don't have biblical thinking, and that's going to lead to conflict, either just in word, but also in deed, and sometimes in violence. And it's like, are those ideals worth fighting for? Well, yes, like I think they are. And so when Emerson is like kind of railing against biblical thinking and and what's there, like you can see the influence. His dad was a Unitarian reverend. He like thought about becoming a reverend, and then he kind of left because he couldn't get along with organized religion. But like to me, the words of the Bible are there, and they are like a completely trustworthy kind of writing, like in a way that no other writing is, because it's God's word. It's not just people's words. It's not even very smart, very great people's words. It is the infallible word of God. And so the same thing with the church. The church is an institution that was put into place by God for our good. And another institution that was created that way, not for the same long-term eternal spiritual good. The government is put there for our own good, Romans 13. And so when you sort of let that inform your thinking, like of course it makes sense that people, maybe not Emerson himself, but people who are around him, of course those sorts of people were the sort of people who like started kind of the last gasp of the utopian camps and towns that exist in the 19th century, which kind of happened first in Europe and then here. But yeah, to me, like I don't know, like especially if he idolizes people like Shakespeare or like Milton or like Carlyle or like whoever, like those people are also the entire English character, and therefore a significant part of the American character is built upon the Bible, like literally the words of the Bible, not just like, oh, biblical culture, Christian culture. Like, no, literally the words of the Bible tell us what an American is. And that's a disagreement I have. I don't know. You want to hop in?
Yeah. Where I see Emerson throwing the baby out with the bathwater is a point I took away from reading Francis Schaeffer's True Spirituality. And it's curious, you mentioned, spirituality versus religion. And it's also kind of a belief I've kind of learned in Chi Alpha Ministries, is that the Christian belief is not that the faith itself saves. It's that the object of our faith saves. And that key distinction, which so often gets confused in the modern American church too, which I think Emerson hits well. Like when you're going to church and you're more concerned with how you appear to others, and you're more concerned about how you sound when you're worshiping and how you're overall, all the factors that go into that, then you have placed all of your faith in faith itself and how you appear, and not the object of your faith, which is Jesus. And because of that, I can't see Emerson as actually pursuing the truth by pursuing the internal, because we are a fallible creature. And and the same thing with Moses when he's like, because of the hardness of your hearts, here's the law. The modern church, I think, is the continuation of that law in the fact that we, because of the hardness of our hearts and our inclination to sin, require an external authority that both not only is a parallel to the Bible in its divine authority, but also is the ability to check yourself. And where government plays in that role is the checks and balances actually applies on a social level too. But on the Christian and spiritual level, there's an aspect they have to ask, where's the object of my faith? And if it's in the faith itself, like Emerson reads to me, and maybe that's an immature understanding and interpretation, but he seems more concerned with the faith itself, the spiritual aspect, that he has removed himself from following the object of the faith. And that's how I'd take it.
No, I think what both of you said sounds really, really helpful and probably true. The only, I mean, I have like more Emerson to read to like fully like sketch out the theological picture that he has. So, but based on like what we've talked about, like your critiques seem pretty sound. And that was like the one thing as I was like thinking about Emerson, where I thought I could save him from all of his like bad opinion, like in a way what sound like bad opinions. And when you really look at them carefully, like, no, actually, for a certain kind of person, at least in the context of the essay, that's actually maybe a good thing. That last part about spiritual versus religious was one where it was like harder and maybe not possible to save him. And in fact, precisely because I was a little bit like not sure how to formulate it. That's a part of like delayed the essay coming out because I wasn't sure. And so what you guys are saying is like helpful for thinking about this.
What I like where Emerson mentions contradicting himself is he is almost grasping with that. And there's an aspect he's fighting himself, saying like, what is this way to actually talk about it? Which I like. Yeah.
Man, this is the thing is, it's like we've only really talked super in depth about Emerson, and like we could get to a lot more with Twain and with Melville and with Hawthorne. But even this little glimpse into the era, the thing is it tells you a lot about the American character of the era, and sort of the thing that I wanted to say here as we're kind of like wrapping up is that the American character is like eternally a struggle of, you mentioned earlier, I think you said the relationship between America and tradition earlier, you mentioned, Brian, and it's like America is highly traditional and also not at the same time. There's a couple different facets of that. And one is like, are we a European civilization? And it's like, okay, yeah, we're Western, but like boring down on it, are we European? It's like, yes, it's a country that started mostly by Anglos with a few Germans and Dutch thrown in. And, later you have the Scots-Irish and the Irish, and then you have later European immigration. And then late in the 20th century, you have a lot more non-European immigration. But even the makeup and character of the American spirit, even when we were mostly European nation, we're still highly distinct from these very old civilizations back on the old continent. And so that's one way that we're very different. And another is sort of like the different sorts of Christians who came over here. You have Christians of one stripe who were supporters of tradition, and like their ancestors would have supported like Charles I during the English Civil War. And then you have the other side, sort of the Puritan side, and lots of people have mentioned this divide before, which is like, no, it's very democratic, and it's very Republican, and it's very against tradition and authority. And those sort of people, there are some people after the Puritans who sort of break out of their traditional mold. And so America, I think, what this era of literature has told us is that America is like constantly in tension between tradition and revolution, I think is probably the right thing to say. People say America's always reinventing itself, and I don't think that's true, but America is always willing to take more drastic steps maybe than other nations would. And I think that's what the literature shows us.
Yeah, I like to think of it in a physics perspective of a pendulum. So potential energy is always the highest when you're at the most extreme. You're away from that center axis. And America hates to be at that center axis. So we are going to swing on one end of the spectrum to the other just to keep that higher potential energy, because that's where change happens.
It's very true. It's very true. To end, just as the final question before we wrap it up, do you think that there are great works on the horizon in America? Why or why not?
I hope that there are. I guess like I'd read, Moby Dick very quickly in the past and did not like absorb the incredible depth, but I'm reading it like very slowly right now and carefully, and I am absolutely astonished to be like a little bit silly, like how deep each of the chapters is. It is just insane what's going on, and like the depth of his learning is just outrageous. Between like how biblically literate you have to be to understand at all what's going on, and also like how like philosophically literate you have to be to understand what's going on. And in some sense, like I'm so inclined to think that the Greeks are the best in a way, and I think before I was foolishly over inclined to think of the goodness of the Greeks, not because they're not good, but just because that can kind of like stunt or blunt your ability to see what's good in others. Like I think I don't know, maybe like 8 or 9 years ago, I thought like, why would I ever care about reading George Washington when I could read Plato? And that's an opinion. Reading Plato is really important, but like our founders, like the people of our nation have something like really important to say, and like their speeches, deeds, thoughts, and writings form the horizon within which like we're like our souls have like grown up in the psychic soil of the United States. Like those are all there, along with other much worse things too. But to understand ourselves and where we've come from and where we're going to, we have to read them. And so, but I guess like maybe what I'm saying is that I'm like actually open to the possibility, at least I'm getting so much out of reading Moby Dick right now. I'm open to the possibility that he might be as wise as Plato or Aristotle. Now, I don't know if that's true. Like I'd have to read the book several times and then like reread Plato and Aristotle. So it's like a lot of work that has to be done. I think Landen talked about humility earlier. So humility is like a necessary virtue in this kind of like enterprise of reading the great thinkers, because they're so much wiser than we are. It's kind of, I feel sometimes silly trying to adjudicate between who's greater, because like I'm not very great. I'm very paltry by comparison, I'm afraid. But like that doesn't make me not want to become more like them. I still have to strive every day to do that. But so that maybe that's by way of saying that if somebody writing in 1851 could somehow have the beauty and majesty of soul to write something that might possibly reach the heights of like what Homer and Plato were doing, then it means like maybe there are lulls, but maybe it's still possible. Like, and it sounds funny to say like, oh, something happened like this in 1850, therefore we can be hopeful now, because that seems like it's a long time ago, but maybe it's not that long ago in a way. And as like Landon was just talking about a second ago, maybe it's like the pendulum's moving in different ways right now. And I think there are a lot of like inspired people who are trying to break free of some of the stultifying conformity that we've like had to endure over the last decade with respect to moral and political opinions. And people are like, it's like they're reawakening to themselves in a way, and like trying to rediscover their native powers that maybe had been hidden from them, or told that they couldn't or shouldn't use them. And so I think there's a kind of like a naive confidence that some people have right now that's like maybe a prerequisite of great and powerful thought. So I'm as hopeful as I've ever been about America and about the possibility of a new great American thinker emerging.
That's a good answer.
I love that.
I think that's as good a place as any to stop. So, Brian, for the audience, where can people find you and connect with your work?
I'm on X/Twitter at MTClassical. I do a lot of spaces there on various things. Like I've done spaces with Riley on like the election and other things. So those have been fun. And I'm going to be doing a series of spaces on Virgil's Aeneid with my friend William Wheelwright starting in January there. So I think that's going to be fun. He has a beautiful reading voice. So we'll kind of like take it, one book a week, kind of like pacing, and I'll kind of have some like, notes like after he's done reading, and then we'll talk about it. And you are all invited to talk about it, anybody who's listening, and especially Riley and Landon, if you have time. And then I just have a Substack, Montana Classical College, and that's where most of my more serious stuff goes. I'm not very good at tweeting, I'm afraid. So I'm just better at talking, like writing like longer form stuff. I'm not going to write anything viral or any bangers. So,
oh well.
So it goes.
Oh well, that's how it is. All right. Well, I'm Riley Stansberry,
and I'm Landon Connor.
I'm Brian from Montana Classical College.
We'll see you guys next time.